January 1945, a B-17 Flying Fortress limps back to England with 2 engines dead, hydraulics destroyed, and the landing gear jammed in the up position. The pilot has no choice, belly landing on the runway is the only option. But there's a problem nobody can solve. Ball turret gunner Sergeant Michael Chen is trapped in the turret. The hydraulics that rotate the turret are destroyed. The manual hand crank system is jammed from flak damage. The turret is stuck in the down position, guns pointing at the ground. Chen is hanging upside down inside that sphere, and he cannot get out. The pilot does the math. When the bomber touches down on its belly, the ball turret will be the first thing to hit the runway. The turret will be ground between 30 tons of aircraft and the concrete runway at 90 miles per hour. The sphere is strong, but not that strong. The turret will be crushed. Chen will be crushed inside it. The crew can hear him on the intercom. He knows exactly what's about to happen. And there's nothing anyone can do to save him. The aircraft landed. Chen survived. Not injured, survived. The ball turret that should have been crushed flat absorbed the impact in a way that nobody, including the engineers who designed it, thought was possible. This is how one trapped gunner lived through a landing that should have killed him instantly. To understand why Chen should be dead, you need to understand the physics of a belly landing. A B-17 at landing weight, around 60,000 pounds with minimal fuel and ammunition remaining, touches down at roughly 90 miles per hour. In a normal landing with gear extended, the landing gear absorbs the impact through shock struts designed to compress and dissipate energy gradually. The aircraft settles onto the runway at a controlled rate. In a belly landing, there are no shock absorbers. The fuselage hits the runway and all that kinetic energy transfers instantly into the structure. The metal skin of the belly scrapes across concrete. If the belly is smooth, the aircraft might slide relatively gently, friction gradually slowing it down. But the ball turret isn't smooth. It's a sphere protruding 3 feet below the fuselage. When a B-17 with a ball turret belly lands, the turret hits first and takes the full impact of 30 tons of aircraft traveling at 90 miles per hour. The Sperry ball turret was engineered to withstand several types of forces. Aerodynamic pressure at high speed and altitude. Recoil forces from firing twin .50 caliber machine guns. The structural loads of the turret's own weight plus the gunner's weight hanging in a sphere attached to the aircraft. But it was never designed to be a landing gear. The specification said nothing about absorbing a belly landing impact because the design assumption was that the turret would be rotated to the stowed position, guns facing aft and up, before landing. Pulling the turret partially into the fuselage and out of the way, Chen's turret was stuck in the worst possible position, guns pointing straight down, turret fully extended. The lowest point of the entire aircraft. When that aircraft touched down, the ball turret would hit the runway first, and the impact forces would be catastrophic. Boeing engineers later calculated the expected impact force at approximately 400,000 pounds, 200 tons, concentrated on the sphere's contact point with the runway. The turret was designed to handle maybe 10% of that force. The crew knew what would happen. The pilot had radioed ahead to the tower. Emergency crews were standing by. The aircraft had enough fuel for maybe 20 more minutes of flight. The pilot had considered ordering Chen to bail out over the English Channel. At least he'd have a chance with a parachute and rescue boats. But Chen refused. Bailing out over cold water in January meant hypothermia and probably death before rescue arrived. He'd rather take his chances with the landing. The pilot respected that decision. Chen would stay in the turret. They would land. Whatever happened next, happened. The rest of the crew braced for the landing. The pilot lined up on the runway, kept the nose high as long as possible to avoid hitting with the forward fuselage first. The B-17 descended in a slight nose-up attitude. The ball turret, with Chen trapped inside, would touch first, followed milliseconds later by the aft fuselage belly, then the nose. The pilot cut power. The aircraft dropped the last few feet. Impact, the sound was catastrophic. Metal screaming on concrete. Sparks visible even in daylight. The ball turret hit the runway at 90 miles per hour and the aircraft's full weight came down on it instantly. From outside, observers saw the turret collapse inward, the bottom of the sphere crushed flat where it contacted the runway. The aircraft slid for nearly 1,000 feet, the turret grinding along the concrete, leaving a trail of metal fragments and sparks. Inside the turret, Chen experienced something that seemed impossible. The impact was violent, a sudden crushing sensation as the turret deformed. But the deformation wasn't uniform. The bottom of the turret, where it contacted the runway, crushed inward and upward. But the crushing wasn't instantaneous. The metal deformed progressively, absorbing energy through the deformation itself. The turret essentially crumpled in a way that spread the impact over several seconds instead of a single instant. More critically, the turret's spherical shape meant it didn't stop moving when it hit. A flat surface hitting a runway would dig in and stop violently. A sphere hitting at an angle rolls. The ball turret hit and immediately began rotating backward as the aircraft's forward momentum forced it to roll along the runway. This rotation dissipated energy. Instead of a static impact absorbing all the force in one location, the force was distributed around the rotating sphere. Chen's position inside the turret was critical to his survival. He was hanging in the gunner's harness, facing forward and down. His body was not in contact with the lowest point of the sphere, the part that hit the runway first. There was approximately 8 to 10 inches of clearance between his body and the turret's lowest point when properly positioned in the harness. When the turret crushed inward, that space was consumed, but the crushing stopped before reaching his body. The impact forces tried to throw Chen forward and down into the crushing lower section of the turret. But the gunner's harness held him. The harness was designed to restrain the gunner during violent aircraft maneuvers and the recoil forces of firing heavy machine guns. It was over-engineered for normal operations, which meant it had safety margins beyond what was typically needed. Those margins saved Chen's life. The harness stretched under the impact load. It wasn't designed to stretch, but all materials stretch under sufficient force, and that stretch absorbed some of the energy that would otherwise have been transmitted directly to Chen's body. The turret crushed inward approximately 6 inches at the impact point. The guns, which had been pointing straight down, bent upward as their mounts were forced backward by the runway contact. The turret's plexiglass panels shattered completely. Fragments of plexiglass flew in all directions inside the turret. Chen's flight suit and gear protected him from the worst of the glass. The oxygen bottle mounted inside the turret broke free from its mounting and struck Chen's leg, fracturing his fibula. But he remained conscious throughout the entire impact and slide. When the aircraft finally stopped sliding, emergency crews rushed to the ball turret expecting to extract a body. Instead, they found Chen conscious and talking. He was hanging in the harness, surrounded by shattered plexiglass and crumpled metal, with blood running down his leg from the broken bone, but alive and alert. The crews couldn't believe it. They'd seen belly landings with trapped gunners before. None of those gunners had survived. The turrets had been crushed flat. This time, somehow, the turret had crumpled just enough to absorb the impact but not enough to reach the gunner inside. After Chen was extracted and sent to the hospital, he'd spend 6 weeks recovering from the broken leg and various bruises and contusions. Army Air Force engineers descended on the wrecked B-17 to understand what had happened. They needed to know if this was luck or if there was some engineering principle they'd missed that could save other trapped gunners. The investigation revealed several factors that aligned to create survival where none should exist. First, the turret's construction method. The Sperry Ball turret was built with a framework of curved ribs, structural members that defined the sphere's shape, covered with panels of steel and plexiglass. The ribs were the primary structure. The panels were secondary, providing the pressure-resistant skin. When the turret hit the runway, the panels and some ribs deformed, but the primary structural ribs held their integrity. The turret crushed but didn't collapse entirely because those main ribs remained largely intact. Second, the ammunition boxes. The ball turret carried 2 ammunition boxes for the twin .50 caliber guns, positioned on either side of the gunner. These boxes were made of heavy steel and were designed to contain a catastrophic cook-off if ammunition ignited from fire or damage. They were essentially small armored boxes. When the turret crushed, these ammunition boxes acted as internal bracing. They couldn't be crushed easily, so they helped maintain a survival space around the gunner even as the outer turret structure deformed inward. Third, the harness design. Boeing and Sperry had designed the gunner's harness to be adjustable for gunners of different sizes. This meant there was built-in slack in the harness system. When properly adjusted for a specific gunner, the slack was taken up, but it was still there in the material and the adjustment mechanisms. Under extreme load, this slack allowed the harness to stretch and elongate, absorbing energy through material deformation rather than transmitting all the force directly to the gunner's body. Fourth, the impact angle. The B-17 had touched down in a slight nose-up attitude, meaning the ball turret hit the runway at an angle rather than straight down. This angle was only 5 to 8 degrees. But it was enough to initiate the rotation of the turret rather than a pure vertical crushing impact. If the aircraft had landed perfectly level or nose down, the impact would have been more directly vertical and likely wouldn't have survived. Fifth, and most remarkably, the runway surface condition. The runway was concrete, not asphalt. Concrete is harder but also more brittle than asphalt. When the steel turret hit the concrete at high speed, it didn't just deform the turret, it also damaged the concrete. The investigation found a gouge in the runway nearly 2 inches deep where the turret had first impacted. That gouge represented concrete being crushed and displaced. The energy required to crush that concrete came from the impact, which meant slightly less energy was available to crush the turret. It was a small difference, maybe 5% of the total energy, but at the margins of survival, 5% can be the difference between life and death. The engineers concluded that Chen's survival was a combination of good engineering, fortunate circumstances, and the specific sequence of events during the impact. It wasn't reproducible. Another belly landing with a trapped gunner wouldn't necessarily have the same outcome. Third, the harness design. Boeing and Sperry had designed the gunner's harness to be adjustable for gunners of different sizes. This meant there was built-in slack in the harness system. When properly adjusted for a specific gunner, the slack was taken up, but it was still there in the material and the adjustment mechanisms. Under extreme load, this slack allowed the harness to stretch and elongate, absorbing energy through material deformation rather than transmitting all the force directly to the gunner's body. Fourth, the impact angle. The B-17 had touched down in a slight nose-up attitude, meaning the ball turret hit the runway at an angle rather than straight down. This angle was only 5 to 8 degrees. But it was enough to initiate the rotation of the turret rather than a pure vertical crushing impact. If the aircraft had landed perfectly level or nose down, the impact would have been more directly vertical and likely wouldn't have survived. Fifth, and most remarkably, the runway surface condition. The runway was concrete, not asphalt. Concrete is harder but also more brittle than asphalt. When the steel turret hit the concrete at high speed, it didn't just deform the turret, it also damaged the concrete. The investigation found a gouge in the runway nearly 2 inches deep where the turret had first impacted. That gouge represented concrete being crushed and displaced. The energy required to crush that concrete came from the impact, which meant slightly less energy was available to crush the turret. It was a small difference, maybe 5% of the total energy, but at the margins of survival, 5% can be the difference between life and death. The engineers concluded that Chen's survival was a combination of good engineering, fortunate circumstances, and the specific sequence of events during the impact. It wasn't reproducible. Another belly landing with a trapped gunner wouldn't necessarily have the same outcome. Chen's survival became somewhat famous within the 8th Air Force. Word spread quickly, trapped gunner survives belly landing. Other crews wanted to know the details. How did he brace? What position was the turret in? Was there something they could do to increase survival odds if they found themselves in the same situation? The Air Force couldn't give them a procedure because there wasn't one. Chen had simply hung in the harness in standard position and hoped. The factors that saved him, the angle of impact, the ammunition boxes, the harness stretch, weren't things a gunner could control or optimize. But they did make changes based on what they learned. First, they modified emergency procedures for aircraft with damaged hydraulics. New protocol required pilots to attempt belly landings with gear up and turret stuck in the down position to delay as long as possible, using every available minute to troubleshoot the turret rotation problem. If rotation couldn't be achieved, the new procedure was to have the trapped gunner brace in a specific position, facing forward, hands on the gun controls to brace upper body, legs pulled up as high as possible to maximize distance from the impact point, and the pilot would land in the shallowest possible nose-up attitude to maximize the impact angle. Second, they expedited the rollout of improved hydraulic line routing on new B-17G models. Many turret jams were caused by flak or fighter fire damaging hydraulic lines. Rerouting those lines through more protected areas of the fuselage reduced the probability of hydraulic failure, which reduced the probability of turrets getting stuck in dangerous positions. Third, and most significantly for Chen, they established a fund for injured airmen. Chen's broken leg and recovery time meant he couldn't fly combat missions anymore. In early 1945, injured airmen who couldn't return to combat were often simply sent home with medical discharge and whatever military disability pay they qualified for. After Chen's case gained attention, there was a push to ensure that airmen injured saving the lives of their crewmates, which Chen effectively did by agreeing to stay in the turret rather than forcing the aircraft to attempt a dangerous bailout over water, received full recognition and support. Chen's survival wasn't a miracle. It was physics, engineering, and specific circumstances aligning in a way that created a survival space where none should exist. The ball turret crushed, but it crushed progressively rather than catastrophically. The harness held, but it stretched enough to absorb shock. The ammunition boxes braced, providing internal structure. The impact angle initiated rotation rather than static crushing. Every one of these factors was necessary. Remove any single one, and Chen dies. The broader lesson is about engineering margins and failure modes. The ball turret wasn't designed to survive a belly landing. But the engineers who designed it had built-in safety margins for the forces they did anticipate: flight loads, gun recoil, pressure differentials. Those safety margins, combined with the inherent strength of the spherical design, created just enough robustness to survive a failure mode that was never in the design specification. This is what good engineering does. It doesn't just meet the minimum requirements. It exceeds them with margins that might seem wasteful under normal conditions but become critical in abnormal conditions. The ball turret's designers never imagined their turret would be used as landing gear. But they designed it strong enough that when it was forced into that role, it performed barely well enough to save a life. Chen returned to the United States in March 1945. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, not for shooting down enemy aircraft, but for the 23 combat missions he'd flown before the belly landing, and for the courage of staying in the turret when bailing out was an option.